Live on national TV, Karoline Leavitt faced down the media's toughest questions. But when Ilhan Omar launched a last-minute attack against her, Karoline didn't just respond, she obliterated the hypocrisy in real time. The press was left speechless, and the truth was exposed for millions to see. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The air inside the White House press briefing room was thick with tension. Every chair was occupied, cameras lined the walls, and journalists whispered among themselves, strategizing their next move. They weren't here for answers. They were here for a spectacle. They had their narratives pre-written, their ambush planned, their loaded questions ready to fire at Karoline Leavitt, the newly appointed White House press secretary. They expected her to stumble, to fold under the pressure. They had done this before, targeting conservatives, twisting words, manufacturing outrage. Today would be no different. Or so they thought. Then the door at the side of the room swung open. Silence fell. Karoline Leavitt stepped in with the composure of a seasoned fighter entering the ring, her heels clicking against the polished floor like a metronome marking the countdown to battle. She moved with calm certainty, head high, shoulders squared. There was no hesitation in her stride, no nervous energy, no forced smile. She already knew how this was going to go. The reporters tensed as she reached the podium, adjusting the microphone with a steady hand. She took a moment, just a moment, to scan the room, to let them feel the weight of what was coming. The journalists shifted uncomfortably under her unwavering gaze. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't intimidated. She was in control. Then she spoke. "Good afternoon, everyone." Her voice was clear, even, carrying the kind of authority that commanded attention without demanding it. The room stilled, pens hovered over notepads, fingers paused mid-typing on keyboards. They were waiting for her to slip, to give them something to pounce on. Karoline let the silence linger just long enough to tighten the tension. Then she smiled. Not the kind of overly polished, rehearsed grin that Washington elites flashed at the cameras. This was something sharper, something deliberate. "I know you've all been eager for this briefing," she continued, her tone smooth but edged with something unmistakably challenging. "So let's get right to it." A murmur rippled through the press. They could sense it. This wasn't going to be their usual routine of attacking and trapping. This wasn't going to be a soft target, a Republican spokesperson tripping over their words, scrambling for the right answer. No, this was a fight. And Karoline Leavitt had just thrown the first punch. She placed her hands firmly on the podium, locking eyes with the front row, where the heavy hitters of CNN, NBC, and the Washington Post sat, waiting for their moment to strike. "Before we begin," she said, her voice dropping into a slightly lower register, a deliberate shift that sent an unspoken message. "Listen closely. Let's establish something." A pause. The weight of her words hung in the air. If the media is going to set the rules of outrage, they should at least be consistent about it. There it was, the first direct challenge. The mood in the room changed instantly. The reporters exchanged glances, their confidence wavering for the first time. They had come prepared to control the narrative, but Karoline had just flipped the game board over before they even made their first move. A hand shot up from the front row. Peter from CNN, always the first to jump in. He was aggressive, known for pushing conservative speakers into tight corners, twisting their words until they barely recognized them. He cleared his throat, trying to mask his uncertainty behind professional skepticism. "Karoline, are you suggesting that Ilhan Omar's comments were meant to incite violence?" The trap was set. The room held its collective breath, waiting for her to step into it. But Karoline? She didn't hesitate. She didn't waver. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp as steel. "I'm not suggesting anything, Peter." She let the words sit. Then she delivered the killing blow. "I'm quoting her, or do you deny she said it?" The room froze. The game had officially begun, and Karoline Leavitt was already winning. For a brief moment, Peter from CNN sat frozen, his mouth slightly open as if searching for a counterattack that refused to form. The silence was deafening. In the back of the room, a few reporters exchanged uneasy glances, sensing what had just happened. Karoline Leavitt had flipped the script. The trap they had set for her had been turned back on them before they even knew what was happening. Peter forced a tight smile, shifting in his chair. He needed to regain control, to reframe the moment before Karoline could press forward. Clearing his throat, he leaned in slightly, his voice coated in feigned concern. "Karoline," he started again, this time slower, as if speaking to a child who had misunderstood something obvious. Ilhan Omar's words were clearly a call for action, not violence. "Are you really saying that criticizing the administration is equivalent to incitement?" Karoline's lips curved into a knowing smirk. "Ooh, I love this game," she said, her tone dripping with mock amusement as she rested a hand on the podium. The context game. The room visibly tensed. Every journalist in attendance knew exactly what she was about to do, but none of them could stop her. Context, she repeated, tapping her fingers against the wood, was apparently irrelevant when President Trump said, and I quote, "Peacefully and patriotically, make your voices heard." She let the words sink in. The air in the press room thickened. "The media didn't care about context then," she continued. "In fact, you all spent 2 years pretending those words were never spoken because it didn't fit the narrative you wanted." Peter's jaw clenched, and a few reporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew she was right. The carefully crafted illusion of neutrality was being ripped apart in front of a national audience. Karoline leaned forward, her voice dropping just enough to force the room to hang on to every word. "But when Ilhan Omar literally says, and again I'm quoting, 'we have to fight in the streets,' suddenly we need to consider the context?" Another pause, a heavy, uncomfortable silence. James from the Washington Post, one of the more seasoned journalists in the room, quickly stepped in, sensing Peter was floundering. "Karoline," he began, his voice measured, careful, trying to sound reasonable. "Surely you see that rhetoric is open to interpretation. What Ilhan Omar meant and how it was received are two different things." Karoline exhaled slowly, shaking her head as if disappointed in their lack of originality. "That's interesting," she mused, tilting her head slightly. "Because when a Republican says anything remotely strong, you don't give them that grace. You don't ask how it was meant. You don't care how it was received." She turned her gaze directly to James, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp as a blade. "You declare it dangerous. You call for resignations. You run headlines about threats to democracy." She stepped back slightly, hands resting on the podium, and sighed theatrically. "I just have one question, James." James raised an eyebrow, his posture stiff. "What's the rule?" she asked, her voice smooth but unmistakably cutting. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the rules only apply to one side." James opened his mouth, then closed it. No response. A ripple of movement ran through the reporters as they scrambled for a new approach. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of Karoline's words settling over them like a lead blanket. Then another hand shot up, Melissa from NBC, trying to rescue the moment before it spiraled completely out of control. "Surely, Karoline," she said, her voice coated with forced politeness, "you're not saying the president is above criticism?" Karoline turned to her, raising an eyebrow as if bored by the question. So was every conservative who got labeled a domestic extremist for questioning the Biden administration, she shot back without hesitation. "Funny how that works." Melissa's smile tightened. She had walked right into it. Karoline scanned the room, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't just responding, she was dismantling the very foundation of their tactics, exposing them for what they were. She took a step back from the podium, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them sweat. Then she delivered the knockout punch. "Let's play a game," she said, her tone eerily calm. "Imagine if President Trump stood here today and said, 'We need to take this fight to the streets.'" The room stiffened. No one spoke. Karoline tilted her head slightly, feigning curiosity. What would happen? Again, no answer. She leaned in just slightly, her voice carrying the weight of a challenge. There'd be front-page hysteria, emergency broadcasts, calls for impeachment. You'd demand resignations, you'd demand hearings. The media would be in full meltdown mode. A few reporters lowered their gazes, pretending to take notes, but they all knew she was right. But Ilhan Omar says it, Karoline continued, her tone suddenly light, almost amused. She shrugged. Nothing, just another Tuesday. The silence that followed was absolute. The press corps had never been so thoroughly cornered, and the cameras were rolling. Karoline placed her hands firmly on the podium, scanning the room one final time before delivering her final words. So, I'll ask again. Another pause. What's the rule? The only response was the clicking of keyboards, the frantic scribbling of notes, the awkward shifting of the reporters who had just realized they had lost. Karoline straightened, exhaled softly, and smirked. Next question. The moment stretched out, thick with unspoken tension. The press corps had been cornered and they knew it. The silence in the briefing room was almost deafening. Not the kind of silence that follows agreement, but the kind that follows a brutal realization. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just here to field their questions. She was here to dismantle their game. But the media wasn't done yet. They couldn't afford to be. A new voice cut through the silence, this time from James, of the Washington Post. He was older, seasoned, the kind of journalist who had survived countless political storms. If anyone could redirect the conversation, it was him. Karoline, he began, his tone measured, his expression carefully neutral. We've addressed Ilhan Omar's remarks, but let's move on to another issue. He flipped through his notes, pausing just long enough to build anticipation. Elon Musk. The president's decision to appoint him as the head of the Department of Government Efficiency. Don't you think that raises concerns about billionaires influencing policy? Several other reporters perked up, sensing an opportunity to shift the momentum. If they couldn't win on the Ilhan Omar debate, perhaps they could catch Karoline off guard with this. Karoline's smirk barely flickered. She saw it coming from a mile away. Oh, so now we care about billionaires influencing policy? She asked, arching an eyebrow. That's interesting. A few reporters shifted in their seats. They could already feel where this was going, and it wasn't going to be pretty for them. Karoline placed both hands on the podium, exhaling as if she were indulging a group of misbehaving children. Let me get this straight, she continued, her voice smooth, controlled. When Mark Zuckerberg spends $400 million to influence elections, when George Soros funds activist groups to shape policy, when Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, by the way, receives billions in government contracts, none of you had a problem with billionaires influencing policy? She paused. The room was utterly still. Then her eyes locked onto James. But when Elon Musk, who actually believes in shrinking the government and cutting waste, is put in a position where he might expose how taxpayer money is being wasted, suddenly, it's a crisis. James tensed. He opened his mouth to respond, but Karoline wasn't finished. I just want to understand the media's standard here, she said, her tone mockingly inquisitive. Is it that billionaires can influence government as long as they fund the right people? Or is it only a problem when they don't align with the Democratic Party? Silence. Again. Peter from CNN jumped in, trying to steer the conversation back into the media's comfort zone. But Karoline, Musk isn't just any billionaire, he interjected, his voice sharper now, more aggressive. He has actively aligned himself with Trump's policies. Isn't this just a case of political favoritism? Karoline gave him a slow, almost pitying look. You mean the same way Hunter Biden got cushy foreign business deals while his father was vice president? She shot back. Or the way Nancy Pelosi's husband magically made all the right stock trades before major legislative decisions. The room stiffened. Peter gritted his teeth, visibly irritated. He had walked right into it. Karoline folded her arms. Funny how political favoritism only seems to be an issue when it involves someone the media doesn't like. A few reporters glanced at each other, their faces strained. They weren't used to this. For years, press briefings had been a game where they dictated the terms, set the traps, controlled the story. But today, Karoline Leavitt was running the show. James from the Washington Post tried to recover. He adjusted his tie, tapping his pen against the notepad. But Karoline, let's talk about oversight. He leaned forward, pushing his last card. Elon Musk now has access to government systems, including financial data in the Department of Treasury and DOJ. Shouldn't the American people be concerned about a private businessman having influence over public finances? Karoline tilted her head slightly, her smirk returning. Let's get our facts straight, James. Her voice was like a scalpel, sharp, precise, cutting right to the bone. Musk isn't writing policy. He's overseeing government efficiency. She scanned the room, daring someone to challenge her. And let's be honest, what really bothers the media isn't Musk's role. It's that he might expose how much taxpayer money has been wasted. A visible shift ran through the reporters. She had nailed it. Peter from CNN opened his mouth to counter, but Karoline wasn't done. You know what's really interesting? She mused, tapping her chin. The media had no problem when former Google and Facebook executives were given top government roles overseeing tech regulations. She let the words linger, watching as the press corps squirmed. But Elon Musk, the guy who actually wants to hold the government accountable? Now suddenly we have to sound the alarms. Silence, again. She had turned their argument into ashes. A younger reporter from MSNBC, desperate to salvage what remained of their attack, tried to shift gears. But Karoline, isn't it fair to say that Musk has his own interests? His companies, including SpaceX and Tesla, have received billions in government subsidies. Doesn't that create a conflict of interest? Karoline sighed, almost disappointed in how weak the question was. That's interesting, she said, tilting her head. Because the Biden administration literally appointed former Google and Facebook executives to government roles overseeing tech regulations. She leaned forward slightly. Somehow, that wasn't a conflict of interest. The young reporter's face flushed red. Karoline turned back to the room, her voice now carrying a sharper edge. This administration was elected to drain the swamp, to cut waste, to make government work for the people instead of career politicians and their donors. She gestured toward the cameras, her tone turning deadly serious. And you don't like that. Because if the government actually became efficient, what would the Democratic Party campaign on? A ripple of murmurs spread through the press corps. They knew what she was saying was true, but admitting it? That was impossible. Karoline checked the time, then turned back to the reporters. All right, she said, her smirk returning. Next question. The press room buzzed with an uneasy tension, a tension that only grew heavier with each question Karoline Leavitt shut down with precision. The reporters were scrambling now, searching for a way to regain control of the briefing, but she wasn't letting up. Every angle they had planned to use against her had been dismantled, brick by brick, narrative by narrative. Peter from CNN, frustrated and eager to shift the narrative, leaned forward again, attempting to strike where he thought Karoline might falter. Karoline, he began, his voice tinged with exasperation, NBC reports that under President Trump's immigration policies, thousands of illegal immigrants who were arrested weren't actually deported. Instead, they were released with ankle monitors or phone check-ins. Doesn't that suggest a failure in the administration's approach? A few reporters nodded, sensing an opportunity to finally put Karoline on the defensive. But she didn't blink. She was waiting for this. Karoline exhaled slowly, almost as if she were disappointed in the attempt. Oh, I'm glad you asked, Peter, she said, her tone carrying that same blend of patience and mockery she had perfected over the course of the briefing. Let's talk numbers. She reached for her iPad, tapping the screen a few times before turning it toward the cameras. As of this morning, over 8,000 illegal immigrants have been arrested under President Trump's policies, she stated, her voice steady and authoritative. Out of those, only 461 have been released. A murmur rippled through the room. The number was far lower than what the media had implied. That's less than 6%, Karoline continued, her gaze locking onto Peter. Yet, the way NBC framed it, you'd think Trump was personally handing out plane tickets. Peter's lips pressed into a thin line, but Karoline wasn't finished. Now, let's contrast that with the Biden administration. She swiped again, revealing a new set of statistics. Under Biden's open order policies, more than 2.3 million illegal immigrants have entered this country in a single year, many of whom weren't even arrested, let alone tracked. Silence. Again. James from the Washington Post saw an opening and seized it, desperate to steer the discussion in a different direction. But Karoline, if Trump's policies were truly effective, why were any of them released at all? Shouldn't we be enforcing a zero-tolerance policy? Karoline tilted her head, feigning curiosity. Oh, now we want zero tolerance? She asked, her voice dripping with amusement. That's interesting because when Trump proposed that, the media labeled it cruel, racist, and inhumane. James's jaw tightened. He had walked straight into the trap. Karoline folded her arms. So let me get this straight. When Trump enforces strict deportation policies, it's inhumane. But when we release a small percentage of detainees due to medical conditions or lack of detention space, because Democrats have blocked funding for more detention centers, mind you, that's somehow proof his policies don't work? The room tensed. She wasn't debating them anymore. She was exposing them. A younger journalist from MSNBC, hoping to salvage the moment, quickly jumped in. But, Karoline, many of these individuals haven't committed crimes. Isn't it dangerous to treat all undocumented immigrants as criminals? Karoline let out a soft, almost pitying laugh. Oh, so now we care about distinctions, she asked, shaking her head. Because I remember when Trump was called racist for deporting MS-13 gang members. Funny how the media suddenly wants to talk about nuance when it suits them. Several reporters exchanged uneasy glances. They had lost their footing. Peter, determined to land a punch, leaned in again. Are you saying the administration bears no responsibility for these releases? Karoline's gaze locked onto him, her expression cool, unwavering. We are deporting as many as possible, she stated plainly, but when Congress actively blocks resources for more deportation flights, more detention centers, and more immigration judges, they don't get to turn around and blame us for not doing enough. The reporters sat still, processing. They weren't winning this battle. Karoline glanced at her watch, then lifted her head with a small smirk. Next question. But before anyone could ask, a sudden ripple of movement ran through the front row. A journalist from MSNBC glanced at his phone, eyes widening. He quickly turned to his colleague, whispering something urgent. A few other reporters checked their devices, their faces shifting. Karoline, always attuned to the energy in the room, noticed instantly. Oh, what is it? She asked, feigning curiosity. Something exciting happening? A journalist cleared his throat. Well, Karoline, he said carefully, Ilhan Omar is live on MSNBC right now, and she's talking about you. The room stilled. Karoline's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. Oh, really? She said, crossing her arms. Well, let's hear it then. A producer scrambled to pull up the live broadcast. The screen flickered to life, displaying Ilhan Omar seated across from Joe Scarborough on MSNBC, her expression tight with frustration. This administration is dangerous, Omar declared, her voice forceful. Karoline Leavitt is spreading lies to cover up for Trump's failures. And let's be clear, she is deliberately putting people's lives at risk. A low murmur spread through the press room. The moment was electric. Karoline chuckled softly, shaking her head. That's cute, she said, her voice calm, controlled. The screen continued playing. The way she dismissed concerns over Trump's rhetoric, it's reckless, it's a direct threat to democracy, Omar continued. And let's not forget, she's using the same dog whistles the far right has been using for decades. Karoline sighed theatrically. Right on cue. The MSNBC host leaned in, pressing Omar. Ilhan, Karoline Leavitt questioned your comments about fighting in the streets. Do you want to clarify what you meant? Omar didn't hesitate. Yes, she said firmly. I was speaking metaphorically. I was calling for people to stand up against this administration's attacks on our rights. But Karoline is twisting my words to distract from what's really happening. The clip ended. The room held its breath. Karoline let the silence stretch out, letting the weight of it settle. Then finally she spoke. That's interesting. Her voice was calm, steady, deadly. She tapped her iPad, pulling up the original quote. Let's rewind, shall we? She read the exact words aloud, word for word. We might actually see somebody get killed. We have to fight this in the streets. She looked up. Tell me, she said, her voice razor-sharp. What part of that sounds metaphorical? Silence. Complete and utter silence. The press corps had lost control. Karoline had won. The silence in the press room was thick, suffocating even. It was the kind of silence that came when people realized they had been backed into a corner with no way out. Karoline Leavitt had just played Ilhan Omar's exact words back to them, stripping away any chance for the media to spin a different narrative. The reporters sat motionless, their carefully prepared rebuttals now useless. Karoline let the quiet stretch for a moment longer, letting them sit in their own discomfort. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, she tilted her head slightly, as if genuinely curious. So, let me get this straight, she said, her voice calm but edged with something far more dangerous. When Ilhan Omar says we need to fight in the streets, the media rushes to explain that she was speaking metaphorically. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room like a hawk surveying its prey. But when President Trump told supporters to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard, you twisted his words into a call for an insurrection? A few reporters shifted uncomfortably. Others refused to make eye contact. James from the Washington Post cleared his throat, trying to recover some control of the situation. Karoline, I think the bigger issue here is the pattern of rhetoric from President Trump and his allies. Karoline let out a quiet laugh, cutting him off effortlessly. Oh, James, she said, shaking her head. You're not about to tell me that Trump's rhetoric is dangerous while Ilhan Omar gets a free pass. James stiffened, knowing he had walked into another trap. Karoline took a small step back from the podium, placing both hands on the edges as she leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering just enough to command absolute attention. This isn't about rhetoric, she said, her tone now sharp as a blade. This is about control. It's about who gets to say what and who gets punished for it. The energy in the room shifted. The reporters weren't just listening anymore. They were absorbing. Karoline pulled up a new set of headlines on her iPad, tapping the screen so the cameras could capture them. Let's look at how you, the media, have framed political rhetoric, she continued, her voice measured but lethal. She read aloud. Trump's violent rhetoric incites extremism, the CNN. Go fast. Trump's words pose a threat to democracy, the Washington Post. Trump's speech fuels dangerous nationalism, NBC. Then, with a deliberate swipe, she revealed the next set of headlines. Ilhan Omar calls for action on civil rights, CNN. Omar's passionate speech highlights injustice, NBC. Ilhan Omar urges Americans to fight for justice, MSNBC. She looked up, her expression cool and unimpressed. Spot the difference? No one spoke. They didn't have to. The hypocrisy was right there in black and white. A murmur rippled through the press corps. Some journalists nervously tapped away at their laptops, likely trying to find a way to spin this. Others sat frozen, knowing full well that Karoline had just exposed them in real time. Peter from CNN, desperate to regain control, finally spoke up. Karoline, are you saying that the media has deliberately misrepresented President Trump's statements? Karoline exhaled sharply, almost laughing at the ridiculousness of the question. Oh, Peter, she said, shaking her head. No, I'm not saying it. I'm proving it. Another flick of her iPad and now a video began playing on the screen behind her, a supercut of Trump's most infamous statements, but this time with full context. The first clip played. Trump, standing at the podium on January 6th, I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard." The room tensed. Then, a CNN anchor's voiceover followed. "Trump incites mob violence." A few reporters glanced nervously at each other. Karoline didn't stop there. The next clip showed Ilhan Omar at a rally shouting, "We need to fight in the streets." Then, an MSNBC anchor's voiceover. Omar delivers a powerful call to action. Silence, complete and suffocating. Karoline folded her arms, giving the reporters a moment to let it all sink in. Finally, she spoke. "You don't report the truth," she said. "You manufacture it." James, from the Washington Post, sat rigid, his face unreadable. Peter, from CNN, clenched his jaw. Others simply sat there, knowing that Karoline had just exposed the entire game they were playing. But she wasn't finished. You label one side as dangerous while propping up the other as noble. You suppress inconvenient truths while amplifying narratives that serve your agenda. She placed both hands back on the podium, her gaze locked onto the cameras now. And Americans see it. They see it every single day. A wave of tension rolled through the room. At that moment, the entire press briefing had shifted. Karoline wasn't just answering questions anymore, she was holding the media accountable. And they had no idea how to stop her. She checked her watch, then looked back up at the press corps, her lips curving into a small, knowing smirk. "Next question?" No one moved. For the first time in years, the media had lost control of the narrative. The tension in the press room was nearly unbearable. Karoline Leavitt had backed the media into a corner, exposing their double standards, and they had no easy way out. The usual smugness on their faces had faded, replaced with unease. The room, once buzzing with energy, was now stiff with uncertainty. The reporters had been prepared to corner her, but she had flipped the entire game on its head. James, from the Washington Post, shifted in his seat, tapping his pen against his notepad, desperate to change the subject. He cleared his throat, his voice carefully measured. "Karoline, let's move on from this and discuss the administration's economic policies. The president recently made some strong remarks about the state of the economy. Can you clarify his position?" Karoline exhaled, tilting her head slightly, a small smile forming. She recognized the maneuver immediately. They weren't interested in discussing the economy. They were looking for an escape route. She crossed her arms, eyes locking onto James with an almost amused expression. "Oh, James," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen this exact playbook too many times before. "Now, suddenly, you want to talk about the economy?" A few uneasy glances darted across the room. Some reporters were already checking their phones, seeing the backlash unfolding in real time. The public wasn't buying the media's spin anymore, and Karoline wasn't about to let them get away with pretending none of this had happened. "Let's not pretend we can just pivot away from this, James," she continued, her tone firm. "You all just spent the last 20 minutes trying to twist my words and cover for Ilhan Omar. Now that the internet is watching and calling you out, you want to move on?" James stiffened, caught in the act. He knew exactly what she was doing, forcing them to sit in the mess they had created. Peter from CNN saw the opportunity and jumped in, his voice laced with frustration. "Karoline, we've given you ample time to respond to the Omar comments. The American people also care about the economy. Shouldn't you be addressing that?" Karoline let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Oh, now you suddenly care about what the American people want to hear?" she asked, her tone dripping with amusement. "That's interesting, because when Americans wanted answers about rising crime, about the crisis at the border, about political corruption, you all conveniently ignored those stories." A visible shift ran through the room. They didn't like where this was going. Karoline wasn't just controlling the conversation, she was exposing the media's tactics in real time, making them answer for their years of selective reporting. She placed both hands on the podium, her expression hardening. "The truth is," she said, "you don't actually care about the economy. You care about protecting your narrative." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the reporters. They weren't used to this. Normally, a press secretary would play defense, scrambling to recover. But Karoline? She was playing offense. James tried to push forward, desperate to regain control. "Karoline, the numbers don't lie," he said, quickly flipping through his notes. "The inflation rate is still high, and many Americans are struggling to afford basic necessities. What is the administration doing to address this?" Finally, a question worth answering. Karoline nodded, acknowledging the shift. She could play this game too. "That's a fair question, James," she said, her tone cooling slightly. "Let's talk about the economy, but let's be honest about how we got here." She turned to the cameras, addressing the American people directly. "The reason Americans are struggling right now isn't because of President Trump's policies. It's because of the reckless spending, anti-energy policies, and economic mismanagement of the last administration." James leaned forward, ready to challenge her. "But, Karoline..." She cut him off smoothly. "No, James, you and I both know that under President Trump, inflation was low, energy was abundant, and wages were rising. But as soon as the last administration took over, they printed trillions of dollars, shut down American energy production, and created the very crisis we're dealing with today." James tried to interject again, but Karoline wasn't finished. "And now," she continued, "you all want to pretend like the damage just magically appeared overnight? That Americans struggling to pay their bills is somehow President Trump's fault? Give me a break." The room stiffened. Some reporters exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they had lost yet another round. Peter from CNN took one last shot. "Karoline, you're blaming the previous administration, but President Trump is in office now. What is he doing to fix the economy?" Karoline sighed, shaking her head slightly. "Peter, for once you're asking the right question, so let me give you a real answer." She straightened, her voice growing sharper. "The president has already taken steps to cut unnecessary regulations, bring back energy independence, and stop reckless government spending. He's focused on rebuilding a strong pro-American economy, not catering to the global elites who profited from the last administration's failures." The press room was silent once more. The reporters had tried to pivot, tried to regain control, but Karoline had met them at every turn, refusing to let them dictate the narrative. She checked her watch, then looked back up, a small smirk forming on her lips. "Next question." No one spoke. For the first time, the media had nothing left to say. The press room had become a battlefield, and Karoline Leavitt was standing undefeated. The media had tried everything, twisting her words, blaming Trump, even pivoting to the economy in an attempt to regain control. Nothing worked. The tension was thick, the energy in the room shifting from aggression to unease. The reporters were no longer trying to land punches. They were trying to survive the onslaught. But Karoline knew they had one more desperate move left. Peter from CNN took a slow breath, shifting in his seat. He had to make this next shot count. "Karoline," he said, carefully choosing his words, "given everything that's happened today, do you believe this administration is doing enough to unite the country? Many Americans feel more divided than ever. Some even fear that Trump's rhetoric could lead to further unrest. Doesn't the president bear some responsibility for the tone of the national conversation?" There it was, the final move in the media's playbook. When all else failed, they blamed Trump for division. They wanted Karoline to walk into their trap, to play defense, to explain or justify. Instead, she smiled. She tilted her head slightly, arms folded, and let out a soft chuckle. "Peter, let me make sure I understand your question," she said. "Are you asking me if President Trump is responsible for the division in this country?" Peter hesitated. He sensed the trap, but had no way out. "Well," he started, "there's an argument to be made that his rhetoric..." Karoline cut him off with a simple nod. "Okay, Peter, let's talk about division," she said, her voice cool but firm. "But if we're going to talk about division, we're going to be honest about where it started." She turned slightly, facing the cameras directly. "America isn't divided because of Trump. America is divided because the media has spent nearly a decade telling half the country that they are the enemy." The room went still. Peter's lips parted slightly, caught completely off guard. "The media," Karoline continued, has spent years calling Trump supporters fascists. They've labeled Christians bigots. They've mocked rural Americans as backwards. They've tried to silence anyone who dares to question their narrative. The reporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They weren't used to hearing their own tactics thrown back at them. Karoline pressed forward, her voice steady but sharp. When Hillary Clinton called Trump supporters a basket of deplorables, did the media say she was dividing the country? Silence. When Joe Biden called half the country semi-fascists, did the media say he was spreading hate? More silence. She let the moment stretch, watching as the unease in the room grew. "And now you sit here and ask if President Trump is the problem?" she said, shaking her head. "No, Peter. The real problem is that the media has spent years demonizing everyday Americans while pretending to be the voice of unity." Peter clenched his jaw, his face slightly red. He knew there was no comeback. James from the Washington Post tried to jump in, flipping through his notes frantically. "But Karoline," he said, his voice slightly strained, "Trump's language has been far more aggressive than previous presidents. His words—" Karoline raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "James, let's be honest. This isn't about words, this is about power." James swallowed hard. He knew where this was going. "The media," she said, "doesn't care about civility. They care about control. They want a world where only one side is allowed to speak, where only one narrative is accepted, and anyone who dares to challenge that, they're labeled dangerous, extreme, or worse." A few reporters glanced at each other, their expressions uneasy. Karoline shook her head, scanning the room. "You don't fear Trump's words," she continued. "You fear that the American people are finally seeing through your lies." The silence in the room was absolute. She checked her watch, then looked back up, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "Next question?" Nobody spoke. For the first time, the press had no more moves left to play. The press briefing was nearing its end, but Karoline Leavitt wasn't finished. The reporters were visibly shaken, their carefully crafted narratives shattered in real time. They had come in expecting to corner her, to force her on the defensive, to make her stumble. Instead, they had been systematically dismantled by a woman who knew exactly how their game was played, and more importantly, how to beat them at it. Peter from CNN sat motionless, his usual smug expression replaced by thinly veiled frustration. James from the Washington Post had stopped taking notes altogether, his fingers frozen above the keyboard. The press room was no longer the battleground they had expected. It was a slaughterhouse. And Karoline was the one holding the blade. A nervous voice broke the silence. "Karoline, let's shift to the public's perception of the administration." She let out a soft chuckle before shaking her head. "Oh no," she said, her tone edged with amusement. "We're not shifting just yet." The room tensed again. "Before we move on, I have one last question for all of you." She folded her arms, eyes scanning the room, her voice dropping slightly, low enough to force them to listen, but firm enough to let them know they weren't escaping this. "When did journalism die?" The words hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. A few reporters stiffened. Others glanced at each other uneasily, waiting for someone, anyone, to fire back. None did. So she continued. "When did you stop asking real questions? When did you decide that your job wasn't to inform the public, but to control them?" Peter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. When did truth become an inconvenience? When did facts become something you had to reshape instead of report? She tilted her head, watching them squirm. When did the media decide that its purpose wasn't to hold those in power accountable, but to protect one party and destroy the other? Silence. Karoline let it stretch, forcing them to sit in the weight of their own hypocrisy. She reached for her iPad, swiping to a set of headlines she had prepared in advance. Then she turned the screen toward the cameras. "Here's what I mean." She read the first headline aloud. "Trump's dangerous rhetoric is a threat to democracy." CNN. Another. "Trump's words incite hate and division." The Washington Post. And then, with deliberate slowness, she swiped to a new set of headlines. "Ilhan Omar's passionate call for action." NBC. Ilhan Omar speaks boldly on injustice, the New York Times. She looked up. Spot the difference? The room remained dead silent. She set the iPad down with a light tap. The American people see through this, she said, even if you refuse to. The reporters sat paralyzed, caught between disbelief and defeat. Karoline knew she had one final blow to deliver. She folded her hands, leaning in slightly. You've spent years telling Americans that questioning the narrative makes them dangerous. A few journalists averted their eyes. You've used words like fascist and extremist to silence half the country. You've rewritten history, twisted reality, and acted as if your bias wasn't painfully obvious to anyone paying attention. She exhaled, shaking her head. And now, when confronted with your own hypocrisy, you sit there in silence? She let those words sink in. And then, with one final glance around the room, she straightened her papers, checked the time, and gave a small, knowing smile. Well, she said, voice laced with finality, that was fun. She stepped back from the podium. The reporters erupted. Karoline, Ms. Leavitt, more question? She didn't look back. She didn't need to, because she had already won. Karoline Leavitt's masterful takedown of the media wasn't just another press briefing. It was a defining moment. In a world where narratives are controlled and truth is twisted to fit an agenda, she exposed the double standards in journalism for millions to see. She stood firm, fearless, and unshakable, proving that facts still matter and that the American people are waking up to the media's games. This story isn't just about politics. It's about the importance of holding power accountable, questioning the narrative, and never backing down in the face of bias. In today's fast-moving world, where misinformation spreads like wildfire, voices like Karoline's are more important than ever. If you believe in standing up for truth, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Together, we can make sure the real story gets told. See you in the next video.